Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today's video is another lore dump, I have to admit. Much like the one I did I did like two as a Tomed primer. Don't worry, we've only got one this time for the primer for the Kithomer massacre. But basically this is just going to be a video where I bring you up to speed on the lore of the Klingon Empire and sort of refresh you prior to the episode the Kithomer massacre. So we'll basically pick up the threads from the Tomed incident. So let's just get into it. So first I'll recap. So as of the Kithomer Accords, the Klingons are not allowed to develop battlecruisers for 20 years, and nor are they allowed to further develop photon torpedo technology for 20 years. That sort of leads them to fall behind in both respects. But this is meant to allow the Klingons to redirect industry towards saving Kronos, which is, in a bit of a free fall as of the time of Star Trek VI. So that's what the Klingons are largely spending all their money on, is, making sure that their planet doesn't die. Now, something that people have mentioned, like as a lore point, it's weird. Some people seem to think that the Klingons relocated planets between Star Trek VI and Next Generation. They moved from Kronos to Quonosh, or Cronus, whatever you want to, the one with the Q. That's not the reason why the name changes. The reason that Cronus is, Cronus is way easier to say than Quonos, but basically the reason the name changes is it's reflective of relations between the Federation and the Klingons. When the Federation and Klingons didn't get on, it's not like the Klingons were telling them how to pronounce the name of their planet, so the Federation just called it Kronos, because that's easy to pronounce. But, with better relations comes, a little bit of, courtesy, and the Federation pronounced it correctly as Quonos. You may see this similar thing today, where overnight we went from pronouncing things from pronouncing Kiev as Kiev, which is the Russianized term, to Kiev. I won't get into any of that, but simply to say that's pronunciation changes for political reasons can happen. Another thing we mentioned in the Tomed incident was the rise of the black market and smuggling within the Klingon Empire, and this is ultimately a result of the demilitarization of the Klingon fleet. So basically what happens is that the Klingon fleet itself is disbanded. The Imperial Fleet, as it is known. The Imperial Navy is disbanded and replaced by the KDF, the Klingon Defense Forces, which is explicitly a defensive force to defend the Empire. It's a small, professional force, loyal to the Chancellor, but it's 150 ships or less. It's very, very small, and it is not enough to police the entire Empire. The result of that is that military assets are, either put in storage, where no one's really paying much attention to them, or secondly, they are sold off to the great houses, and this ultimately gives rise to a black market. Not only will things perhaps go missing from the boneyards, but also certain great houses might want to make a little bit extra cash on the side. So this brings us to the fact that the Klingon Empire at this point enters an age of neo-feudalism. They were sort of in the throes of it during the 22nd century. They were not unified, and they were just really a collection of war bands. That ultimately changes as the 22nd century wears on, as the Klingons take on bigger and bigger prey. They end up centralizing more and more. And eventually the case for centralization is made in the 4 Years' War, where the Klingons act as a centralized military, although they are still kind of semi-irregular. However, the results of the 4 Years' War, and then the second war that they had with Starfleet in the 2250s that we don't talk about, the Klingons realize, no, centralization is the way to go, and we need to centralize things further, and that's where the fleet of the 50s and 60s comes in, where it's all very unified and a uniform fleet. And that's ultimately the height of centralized power in the Klingon Empire. The Chancellor is the ultimate, dictator of the state and has complete control over the military. In this period, after the Kithomer Accords, and with, again, the need for government funding to be used to support Kronos and, not let it fall to ruin, they aren't funding the military anymore. And so, nor are they funding a lot of things. And so what it ultimately means is that the great houses are called upon to take on many of the operations of the state, including local, regional policing and, military operations. So essentially, the Chancellor gives up, the office of the Chancellor gives up a lot of its absolute power, which it had during the 23rd century, and gives it back to the nobility. And the ultimate result of this is that old rivalries between the different houses quickly resurface and reemerge, and soon enough, the dictating factor is no longer, the Chancellor is no longer in control. They are merely a puppet or a figurehead of the nobility, of the aristocracy, and ultimately are subject to the aristocracy. Now, in terms of political factions, there's essentially two factions within the Klingon High Council. You have the reformists. These are the modernizers. They want to change the Empire, move it away from being a solely warrior-focused culture and more into a, generalist society. Examples of people like this were Moog. Early career Gowron was actually kind of interested in these ideas. We'll see other reformers, but those are ones that come to mind. And then you have the martialists. These are, traditionalists who want to rebuild the military and potentially re-centralize the empire and imperial power. They want to basically, fix Kronos and then get back to what they were doing in the 23rd century. And this includes people like Duras and Kor. Now, it's worth saying that at this point, being pro-Romulan or being pro-Federation isn't really a thing. Like, it doesn't really factor into the discussion. They have a historic alliance with the Romulans. They've concluded peace with the Federation, but, that's all it is. It's a peace. We're just agreeing not to fight them for now. There's not really, no one's saying, we should be more friends with the Federation than the Romulans. Politics is very much internally focused within the Empire, and international relations are very much considered the, second. We'll get to that eventually, but, first we've got to decide how we're going to reform and rebuild the Empire from the disaster that befell us. So, essentially, that's the basic breakdown of Klingon politics in this era. Klingon politics is much like the British Parliament. It's full of pomp, circumstance, and ceremony, and is incredibly rowdy. Why do you think in the British Parliament the opposition and the government are separated by 2 sword lengths? You can imagine the Klingon High Council playing out in a very similar way. Even though I've explained that the Chancellor doesn't have a lot of power in this point and is largely subject to the will of the aristocracy, they are still a figurehead, and they are still, they are associated with their eras. So we'll get into that, and we'll get into the different chancellors that we see up until the Battle of Narendra 3. There we will leave off, but we'll just take you up to there and talk about the various developments. So the first chancellor to talk about is Azet Bur. Now, she lasts from 93 to 2311. So a decent stint for a Klingon chancellor, especially for a woman. There's a whole thing about there is how much did her sex protect her. It's not the dumb thing to directly challenge her, but at the same time, she's not invulnerable. These are Klingons. They're not gonna white knight for her. They're not. The Klingons are not known for simping. Anyway, so essentially, what Azet Bur did in her tenure as Chancellor was she was responsible for a lot of rapid reforms. Now, ultimately, these are the rapid reforms that I've largely described: the demilitarization, the restructuring of government, very wide-reaching and sweeping changes that brought a lot of instability, and so she was regarded with a lot of controversy. The one thing that people actually kind of agreed on was that she was right to stay neutral in the Tomed incident. But that's about it, and that was merely because the Empire was not in a position to weigh in on either side. But if things had been different, she certainly should have taken a side and been a more active participant. Anyway, she was assassinated end of the day. So again, being a woman did not protect her that much. But, she did 93 to 11, so a decent stint, and longer than some. Okay, so the next guy is General Cragg. So this guy basically came to power after the assassination of Azat Burr, and was basically put in place by her assassins. He banned women from holding office in the Klingon Empire. Now, that wasn't completely revolutionary. Women did hold office, but it was very there's a whole thing that can be talked about women serving on the council and everything like that. Essentially, it wasn't well liked because women had certain advantages over their male counterparts when it came to politics. That being that they didn't run off to die in glorious battle in the same way that the men did. And so if left to their own devices, it would be very likely that the matriarchs, would simply dominate Klingon politics and may even well just, happily... I'm sure there are plenty of Klingon women who would happily start a war with somebody just so that they could get shot of their husbands. So that's it wasn't a completely novel sentiment. And equally, next Chancellor along could undo that if they wanted. But he banned women from holding office. Now, he was a martialist and he attempts re-centralization, but ultimately it's blocked. A lot of the great houses, even the more martialist great houses like the House of Duras, or Gerard as it's known at this point, they aren't keen on re-centralization. They would much rather build up their own power underneath the Chancellor, and they can always centralize later once they get control of the Empire. He did all right as a Chancellor, but he wasn't able to do too much. He ultimately died of natural causes, presumably of drinking and whoring and generally enjoying himself, but certainly didn't do much, and arguably wasted precious time. Right. Next guy along is Di-tagh. He ruled from 2323 to 2334. Like the previous guy, he was a martialist, and he actually did undertake some pretty significant action. He instigated the B'Trekan Nebula conflict. Essentially, he was trying to reassert the Empire and, perhaps quite smartly realized that the best thing to do would be to pick a relatively minor power to have a little bit of a spat with. And thus, if they could defeat them, that would show renewed strength in the Empire. So he instigated the B'Trekan Nebula incident. But then ultimately, he was replaced by Kravach. It's not specified, and it's not specified how he left office. Whether he left office willingly, whether he died of natural causes, or left in a body bag. Next guy is Kravach, from 34 to 46. And he was a reformist. He was very much responsible for liberalizing Klingon society. Guys like Martok really got saw a lot of advancement. Generally, there was a lot more emphasis was placed in Klingon society on meritocracy and not on birth. A move away from, what was traditionally very much, held by the ruling families. Now, he resolved the B'Trekan Nebula crisis, presumably to the Klingons' benefit, it's uncertain, but he did continue to see tensions with Cardassia, and this actually left him vulnerable because he forgot about other neighbours to his north. Other neighbours who had a bit of a bone to pick with the Klingons. Kravach ultimately looked more outwards and didn't see the council polarize beneath him, nor did he see how certain outside elements might take advantage of that and seek revenge on the Klingons. And that is where I will leave it. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. please leave your comments below. And I will now thank my members, my Navarchs, David Reeves, Tully DT, and Jeffrey Ballard. My commanders, Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Gilmo Martinez, Das Blas, and Adam Bowman. And I thank my loyal Centurions, Nathaniel Mead, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Marcus Hall, Paul Lash, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, and Orcolcatum Questo. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video. By the time the traitor is revealed, the fate of Moog will already be sealed.